My name is Eleni Schirmer. I'm coming here from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I'm a grad student, a PhD candidate in the School of Education in the Department of Curriculum and Instruction and Educational Policy Studies. I am a native of Wisconsin, of Madison in fact, and I am a proud member of our graduate student employee union, AFT Local number 3220, the Teaching Assistants Association. So I'm very happy to be here among so many interesting and like-minded, politically committed folk, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak today. What I'm going to talk about is Wisconsin Act 10, which was the latest sort of rehearsal in neoliberal politics in Wisconsin, or at least one of them, with Governor Scott Walker acting as the poster boy of the Tea Party Republicans. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about a couple of things. One, I'm just going to narrate a few of the events, what happened, the origins of the bill, and then I'm going to transition and talk about a little bit of research that I've done interviewing teachers in the aftermath of the bill to find out how teachers conceptualize the origins of the attacks on the public sector and public sector employees. So forgive me for no visuals. I know it's late in the day, so you can space off and I won't know, but you can listen and I'll feel a little happy. So on February 14th in 2011, Scott Walker proposed this bill. It was first called the Budget Repair Bill. It's since been cemented into law as Wisconsin Act 10. It was cut public sector bargaining rights to be wages capped at inflation only. So some of the remarks at the beginning that Dr. James Kirk was saying that unions should argue for things like academic freedom and things like this, healthcare benefits, academic freedoms, work conditions, all that off the table. It's wages capped at inflation only. It also restricted the recertification rights for unions. So now unions have to be 51% of the voting unit or bargaining unit has to approve the recertification vote, which would be like akin to 51% of the state of Wisconsin having to vote every year for Scott Walker to remain in office. And surely if that were the test, we would no longer have Governor Walker in office anymore, but unfortunately that only happens to the unions. And also it withdrew provisions for automatic dues withdrawal and therefore eliminated fair share dues payment. So unions are in a pretty bleak state in Wisconsin. So there's a few things that I want to talk about for the origins. One, this is not surprising to anybody. I'm sure this is part of a national and international movement to apply pressure to workers and workers' rights. And it's running true to form that it's using arguments. This Walker's bill was based on arguments that public services and their employees cost too much, that they're ineffective and enable lazy, bad people, and that the bureaucracy that enables them is just like absolutely asinine. So these were some of the arguments. A couple of the points that I want to bring to your attention about Wisconsin specifically are that Walker actually entered office with a budget surplus. So this idea that there was a budget repair bill was a total sort of hocus pocus that Walker was able to do. That in fact, to the extent that the Wisconsin state budget was in the red when he took office was because of tax cuts that he enacted and a Medicaid shortfall. So this is like a very important premise that's not part of that wasn't part of a lot of the dominant narrative. And the second thing is that when Walker entered office, he took over from the previous governor had been a Democrat, sort of a standard liberal Democrat, and under Democratic governor, Democratic House, and Democratic Senate, the state workers had expired contracts and had been operating under expired contracts. In fact, since 2009, for 2 years, they were operating under expired contracts. And when Democrats had control, they had failed to proactively shore up rights for workers. So when Scott Walker came to office, who was a declared opponent of public sector employees, they were particularly vulnerable. So this is some of the background that I think is sort of important, at least interesting history. So what happened? How did unions respond to this? Well, union leadership sputtered, absolutely sputtered. Mary Bell is the president of the Wisconsin State Teachers Association, and she, a few days before actually the bill was proposed, Act 10 was proposed, she had independently gone to Scott Walker and had offered a number of very radical concessions that a lot of union members around the state were very surprised by. She had proposed that the state of Wisconsin adopt a mayoral control of Milwaukee public schools. This is something that a lot of unionists and public school advocates are very opposed to. And she had also offered to implement new performance pay mechanisms for teachers. And this was also, again, something that the State Union Teachers Association had previously opposed. But as it were, Walker was not interested in these concessions. He had a plot of his own in mind that he ushered out a few days later. So the union leadership was in no space to actually defend workers' rights at this point in time. But what's interesting is that actually the rank and file teachers in Madison decided that they were not going to watch their union crumble under their own eyes, and they began a pretty serious and intense discussion about what they were going to do. So this was a troublesome issue, especially for teachers. The issue of striking for public school teachers is a complicated one, and a lot of teachers engaged. In part of my interview, some of the teachers said things like, we weren't walking out on our kids, we were walking out for our kids. And this was the part of the work, it's part of the conversations that happened in these unions, was that that there was a process of reframing that the number of the union leaders realized they needed to engage in. So the Madison teachers decided to call in sick, organize the sick out. The next day, or within 2 days, the president of the State Teachers Association encouraged teachers from around the state to also call in sick. And then within the following weeks, union members, public sector, private sector, employed people, unemployed people came to Madison and were part of a 2-week occupation of the Capitol that has been proudly gone down in history as the Wisconsin Uprising. So that's the background. Now, I want to go back to something that I talked about earlier, which is this idea of how teachers framed their understanding of Wisconsin Act 10. I think this is an important issue because, well, for number one, that all of the teachers who I talked to disagreed with the bill, but they all had very different reasons for doing so. And my question was provoked by this idea of what kinds of spaces do these different reasons open up for resistance to these neoliberal attacks on education. So this is in part based on some of the literature about framing and the importance of framing in social movements, and particularly the role of framing and ideology construction. So part of my question is based on the premise that how we define, that one of the projects of social movements is to define the categories that we see the world in, and that conditions that we see as Francis Fox Pippin would say, conditions that we see as just and immutable can become seen as unjust and mutable. So what gets defined as part of the purview of public debate is critical to this, and framing is an important way, a sort of a rhetorical and ideological strategy we use to decide what can be changed and what can't be changed. So there's a few things that I would like to talk about. So the three frames that I found that teachers use was mostly, all of the teachers who I talked to saw that the private sector was this idea of this adversary, and in social movement framing there's the good guy, the bad guy, and what you're fighting for. So the private sector by and large was always the bad guy, that these teachers understood they were vulnerable because of pressure applied from the private sector, which is an interesting finding. The second finding that was interesting was that where the variation occurred was how teachers saw why the private sector was motivated. So a number of teachers, in my sort of first frame, the three frames that I'm going to run through with you guys are the private sector operated as a mirror, the private sector operated as a horizontal rival, and the private sector operated as a dismantler. So, as a mirror, teachers saw that the attacks on teachers in the public sector were motivated by an understanding that the private sector operates more efficiently than the public sector, and therefore the private sector must reorganize itself to emulate the private sector. So teachers who were operating under this frame said things to me such as, I knew the private sector had taken a lot of hits. I know that my husband had taken a 5% pay cut and my brother-in-law got reduced hours. I was aware that the pain was going on in the private sector. And for teachers, what made this, they could empathize with this idea that the private sector was taking a fall after the financial downturn. And the public sector, what made the attack immoral, let's say, was that Scott Walker had gone too far, that these attacks had just gone too far. They had just taken something a little bit too deep. So teachers in this frame said things like, had Scott Walker left it at, we're going to ask you to pay more into your pension, we're going to make you pay more into your insurance, then there wouldn't have been a problem. So that's kind of an interesting idea that there's an issue of magnitude, really, that the public sector probably ought to act more like the private sector. It's just that Scott Walker had applied too much pressure. So a second frame is that this idea of the horizontal rival. And under this frame, teachers found that the private sector was motivated to attack the public sector because of rights that the public sector employees had that had been denied to private sector, specifically healthcare. So this came down to teachers felt like they were being attacked by other workers who were in the same relative class for benefits that teachers had that other private sector employees did not have. As one teacher told me, they're not looking at what's happening to the upper class taking 90%. This guy next to me, who I'm sharing 10% with, is getting 8%, not the guys in front of me taking 90%. Let's not talk about the 90% that's being withheld from us and shouldn't be. So what fails to get centered in this frame is the fact that teachers negotiated for their health care benefits in exchange for wages over a period of 10 to 15 years in Wisconsin. So this frame sort of distorted an understanding of the historical negotiations and trade-off and bargaining that teachers had engaged in order to have health care. The final frame that I found teachers used to explain the actions of the private sector was this idea of the private sector as dismantler. So under this frame, teachers understood that the private sector was attempting to dismantle the public sector in an attempt to accumulate resources elsewhere. And teachers in this frame generally connected what was happening in public education to other sectors that were happening in the environment, to healthcare, to all kinds of public service and regulation. And teachers in this frame told me things like, we started defunding and we wake up a little bit and we see that the political elections are taken over, and we start to see at the same time the introduction of charters and vouchers, and now we're here. And we've been slashing the budget since the 90s, so when Walker comes onto the scene, we're past bare bones. We've already cut. Their next thing will be a complete removal of public education. And what was interesting to me about the teachers who use this frame of the private sector as the dismantler was that I found that the teachers who had the most involvement in their unions were the ones that had this frame, which I consider to be the most sophisticated, because it doesn't rely on ideological mystifications or obfuscations to assemble the pieces. It correctly centers the political actions. I found that basically, to summarize, that the different frames that teachers use to theorize about the private sector at times denaturalized its role in state policy formation and were able to open more spaces for political resistance. And that unions in particular were one space where teachers could begin to develop these ideologies that challenged the dominant thinking. But that certainly not a given, and that there's a necessary need for political struggle and conversation to promote these. That although all of these teachers disagreed with the bill, they had different reasons for doing so, and that opened up different spaces and different strategies. So that's my